The Sharan oil refinery in Tehran has been hit in the latest US-Israeli strike.
Israeli warplanes have struck 3 oil storage depots and refining facilities in the Iranian capital.
Last night, across parts of Iran, people woke up thinking it was morning. Not because the sun had risen, but because the sky suddenly lit up. Bright, violent, blinding. One resident described it in just a few words. Words that are now spreading across social media. The night turned into day. Oil depots, huge fuel storage facilities, the lifeblood of Iran's economy, suddenly turned into targets. Massive strikes hit multiple locations connected to Iran's oil infrastructure. Storage tanks, fuel depots, industrial terminals, and when these things explode, they don't just burn, they roar. You're talking about thousands, sometimes millions, of barrels of fuel stored in giant metal tanks. When one of them ignites, the fireball alone can light up half a city, which is why residents miles away said their windows shook. Alarms went off, and for a moment, people genuinely thought the sun had come up early. Except it wasn't the sun, it was war. The Middle East right now is sitting on top of multiple overlapping conflicts. Iran, Israel, US military bases, proxy groups, shipping routes, sanctions, energy politics, all of it tangled together like a giant knot. And when you see oil depots exploding, the first question analysts ask is simple. Is this economic warfare? Because destroying oil infrastructure doesn't just hurt one night's production. It disrupts supply chains, it damages storage capacity, and it sends a message to global markets, a message that says, things are not stable, and markets hate instability. Within hours of the strikes, traders were already watching closely. Because Iran may not dominate global oil exports the way Saudi Arabia does, but it still plays a major role in regional energy flows, especially through shadow trade networks, tanker shipments, and strategic partnerships. China, Russia, and several countries that quietly buy Iranian oil despite sanctions. So when oil depots burn, people in trading floors from London to Singapore start paying attention, very quickly. And here's something interesting. Sometimes the psychological impact of a strike is bigger than the physical damage. Let's say a depot storing a few 100,000 barrels is destroyed. That's serious. But the bigger issue is uncertainty, because once infrastructure becomes a target, investors start asking, will it happen again? Could pipelines be next? Ports? Shipping terminals? And suddenly, the risk premium on oil starts creeping up, which means fuel prices, shipping costs, even airline ticket prices can start moving, all because of explosions thousands of kilometers away. That's the strange interconnected reality of the global economy. But let's go back to Iran for a second, because internally, strikes like this carry another meaning. They challenge the image of control. Governments work hard to project stability, strength, security. So when massive industrial facilities explode, especially ones tied to national revenue, it raises uncomfortable questions. How did this happen? Was it an external strike, sabotage, internal infiltration, drone attack, missile strike, cyber operation leading to an explosion? But to understand why these oil depots matter so much, we need to look deeper, not just at Iran's energy system, but at how oil connects the power struggles between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Because behind every burning oil tank, there's usually a much bigger game being played. Now we're going to unpack that game. Who might be behind the strikes, why oil infrastructure is becoming a strategic target again, and how this incident could reshape tensions across the Middle East and beyond. Because the flames lighting up the Iranian sky last night may be illuminating something much bigger and far more dangerous. Let's slow down for a moment, because what happened in Iran is not just about explosions, it's about power, and more specifically, energy power. Because oil, whether people like it or not, still runs the modern world. Cars, planes, ships, factories, even the plastics in the device you're probably watching this video on. Oil is everywhere, which means when oil infrastructure becomes a target, it's never just a local event, it becomes geopolitical. Now think about this. Iran is sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on the planet. Not small, not moderate, massive. Only a handful of countries can compete with it. Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, and a few others. But here's the problem Iran has faced for years: sanctions, heavy sanctions. For decades, Western sanctions have tried to choke Iran's ability to sell oil freely on the global market. But Iran didn't just sit there. No, they adapted. Quietly, creatively, and sometimes cleverly. Iran built a shadow oil trade network, tankers that turn off tracking systems, oil transfers at sea, shipments routed through third countries, cargoes that magically change origin halfway through the journey. It's almost like an international spy movie, except with crude oil. And despite sanctions, billions of dollars in Iranian oil still find their way into global markets every year, a lot of it going east, to China. China has quietly become one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil. Not officially, of course, but practically. Because China needs energy. A lot of it. Factories don't run on good intentions, they run on fuel, and Iranian oil often comes cheaper than global market prices, which makes it attractive. Very attractive. So when oil depots inside Iran are hit, China notices. Very quickly, because any disruption to Iranian oil flows can ripple into Chinese energy planning. And China hates uncertainty, but China is not the only player watching. Russia is also paying very close attention because Russia and Iran have grown much closer over the past few years, especially since Russia's war in Ukraine triggered massive Western sanctions. Suddenly, Moscow and Tehran found themselves in a similar position, both sanctioned, both looking for alternative markets, both trying to bypass Western financial systems. And something interesting happened. They started cooperating more, energy deals, military coordination, technology exchanges, even discussions about alternative trade systems that bypass the dollar. So when Iran's energy infrastructure burns, Moscow doesn't just see flames, they see strategic pressure, pressure on an ally, pressure on a partner in the emerging anti-sanctions network. And then there's the United States. Now, Washington officially says it is not seeking direct war with Iran. But at the same time, the US has thousands of troops across the Middle East, military bases in the Gulf, naval fleets in nearby waters, air power stationed within striking distance. And American policy toward Iran has always balanced two competing goals: contain Iran's influence, without triggering a regional war. Not an easy balance. Now, historically, oil infrastructure has been targeted before, many times. In 2019, the world watched as major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia were attacked. Global oil markets panicked overnight. Prices jumped, analysts scrambled, and suddenly the vulnerability of energy infrastructure became very clear because these facilities are massive, but they're also fragile. Huge storage tanks, pipelines, pumping stations, refineries. You damage a few critical points and supply chains start wobbling, which is why governments spend billions protecting them. Air defenses, security patrols, surveillance systems. But even with all that, determined attackers sometimes still find gaps, especially with modern technology. Drones, long-range missiles, cyber-sabotage, covert teams. The battlefield is evolving, and energy infrastructure sits right in the center of it. And suddenly, the entire oil trade becomes more costly, even if only a few facilities were actually hit. That's the domino effect. A single strike can trigger financial ripples across an entire industry. And remember, oil markets are extremely sensitive. Sometimes prices move dramatically, not because of actual supply loss, but because of fear of future disruption. Markets trade on expectations, not just reality, which means the psychological impact of the Iranian strikes may be just as important as the physical damage. And if energy becomes vulnerable, the entire global economy feels it. Fuel prices, transportation, manufacturing, food supply chains, all of it is tied together, which is why governments are watching this situation very carefully. Because escalation could move in several directions. Iran could respond, directly or indirectly, through cyber operations, through proxy groups, through maritime pressure in strategic waterways, or through diplomatic channels designed to rally support. And that's where geography becomes important, very important. Because Iran sits near one of the most critical oil choke points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Think about that, 1/5. Every day, tankers loaded with crude pass through that corridor, heading toward Asia, Europe, global markets. So whenever tensions rise involving Iran, energy analysts immediately start asking the same question. Will shipping through Hormuz remain safe? Because if it doesn't, then the global oil market could face serious disruption. And nobody, not even Iran, truly wants that level of chaos. But geopolitical crises don't always follow rational scripts. Sometimes they escalate because leaders feel pressure, domestic pressure, military pressure, political pressure. Now, let's zoom out for a moment, because when you step back from the flames, the smoke, the explosions, you begin to see something bigger forming, something that has been slowly building over the last decade, a new kind of geopolitical struggle, not just over land, not just over ideology, but over energy control. And the truth is, we are already living in it. The world may not call it an oil war, but look closely. Energy infrastructure is quietly becoming one of the most strategic targets on the planet. Pipelines, refineries, storage depots, shipping routes, all of them are increasingly part of the modern battlefield. And the strikes inside Iran are a reminder of just how fragile that system really is. Because oil is not just fuel, it is power. Economic power, political power, military power. And whoever can disrupt it, even briefly, can shake entire economies. Now think about the timing of all this. The global energy system is already under pressure. Russia's war in Ukraine disrupted European gas supply. Sanctions reshaped global oil flows. China's energy demand keeps growing, and developing countries are fighting to secure affordable fuel for their economies. So the system is already tight, already sensitive, already nervous, and then suddenly, oil depots explode in Iran. You can imagine what traders, analysts, and government officials were doing at that moment, watching, calculating, trying to figure out if this was a one-night event or something bigger. Because if energy infrastructure becomes a repeated target, the consequences could be massive, not just for Iran, but for everyone. Now here's where things get complicated, because Iran is not an isolated country. It sits right in the middle of one of the most strategically important regions on Earth, the Middle East. And this region holds a huge share of the world's oil reserves: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Iran. Together, they influence the energy supply that keeps global industry running, which means instability here rarely stays local. It spreads through markets, through diplomacy, through military alliances. And right now, several global powers have deep interests in this region. The United States has long maintained a major military presence in the Gulf. Aircraft carriers, air bases, missile defense systems, naval patrols protecting shipping routes. For decades, Washington has viewed stability in Middle Eastern energy supply as a national security priority, not just an economic one. Because energy disruptions can affect global markets, and global markets affect political stability. But the geopolitical map is shifting. China is now the largest importer of oil in the world, and a large share of that oil comes from the Middle East. So Beijing has quietly expanded its economic and diplomatic presence across the region. Energy deals, infrastructure investments, strategic partnerships. China is not deploying aircraft carriers like the United States, but it is building influence in other ways: trade, technology, investment. And China's message to many countries in the region is simple: we need energy, you need markets. Meanwhile, Russia is playing its own strategic game. Despite sanctions and the war in Ukraine, Russia remains one of the world's largest energy exporters. Oil and gas are central to its economy, and Moscow has been working to reshape global energy alliances. Closer ties with China, closer ties with Iran, new trade routes, alternative financial systems, all designed to reduce reliance on Western economic structures. So when Iranian oil depots burn, these global players are not just watching the fire, they are watching the strategic balance. Because every disruption, every strike, every escalation changes the calculations. In geopolitics, events like this are rarely isolated. They are chapters in a longer story, a story that is still unfolding. And the question now is simple. Was this a single strike or the beginning of a much larger confrontation? The world is watching. Energy markets are watching. Governments are watching. And so are millions of ordinary people trying to understand what all of this means for the future. But now we want to hear from you. What do you think about these strikes on Iran's oil depots? Do you believe this was a warning, a strategic move, or the beginning of something much bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this analysis helpful, support the channel by liking the video. Also subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories shaping our world. Because in times like these, staying informed matters more than ever.